Okay, so this Saturday, all eyes in Australian politics are going to be on the federal election.
Yep, definitely.
There's a real sense this one could go either way. The polls right now show Anthony Albanese, the Labour Prime Minister, he's got a lead.
A slight lead over Peter Dutton, who's leading the opposition Liberal Party.
But yeah, the amount of analysis, the speculation, it's been pretty intense leading up to it.
It really has.
So for this deep dive, we're digging into a question that keeps popping up, especially after I saw this piece on CNN. It's this idea: why are Australian conservatives apparently worried about a Trump slump?
Right, this idea that Trump's standing, or maybe his recent actions, could somehow hurt their election chances.
Exactly. So we want to unpack those connections, the ones being drawn across the Pacific, and figure out what's really at stake here.
It's a fascinating angle, isn't it? How someone, a political climate so far away can cast such a big shadow over politics here in Australia.
Okay, let's get right into it then. This Trump slump idea. One thing that really jumped out was this nickname for Peter Dutton, Timu Trump. What's the deal with that?
Ah, yeah, Temu Trump. Well,
Yeah.
Temu is, the Chinese online shopping site known for really cheap stuff.
All right, okay.
So critics use that nickname to suggest Dutton is like a budget version of Donald Trump, maybe less authentic, trying the populist style, but, well, maybe not quite hitting the mark the same way.
Okay, so it's definitely not a compliment.
No, not at all.
And I assume Dutton hasn't exactly embraced it?
Definitely not. He's pushed back pretty firmly. He said something like, I'm my own person. He's clearly trying to define himself separately.
Makes sense. He probably sees the downside of being tied too closely to Trump right now, especially in Australia.
Precisely. Which leads us to, the actual comparisons people are making.
Mm-hmm.
The article mentions Frank Bongiorno from ANU. He sees some real parallels in Dutton's style.
Yeah, what sort of things is he pointing to?
Well, Bongiorno highlights what he sees as Dutton's right-wing populist instincts, the rhetoric.
Okay, like what specifically?
Things like stoking culture wars, picking fights over social issues, some similar language around migration levels, and even calling the public broadcaster, the ABC, hate media.
Okay. So those are tactics that definitely sound familiar from the Trump playbook.
Exactly. It's less about specific policy alignment, maybe, and more about that combative style, that way of engaging.
And the thinking is, these comparisons are actually backfiring on Dutton. They're not helping him.
That seems to be the analyst's take, yeah. That instead of giving him a boost, the association with Trump, particularly given some of Trump's recent, let's say, global actions, it's actually hurt Dutton's standing, eroded whatever lead he might have had.
Which is interesting because, as the article points out, some senior liberals, even Gina Reinhart, were apparently encouraging a more Trumpian strategy earlier on.
Yeah, that's a slight contradiction, isn't it? I think the initial thought in some conservative circles might have been, hey, maybe this could work here too. Tap into that same kind of voter energy.
A Trump bump, maybe they hoped.
Something like that. And Reinhart, she attended Trump's inauguration, supports his drill baby drill ideas.
Yeah.
There's clearly some ideological overlap and maybe a belief his methods could work.
But then came this Trump slump. What was the turning point? And how does Canada fit in?
It seems like Trump's announcement about global tariffs was a big moment, a real turning point.
Ah, the trade stuff.
Yeah. Suddenly, maybe aligning too closely didn't seem like such a great idea. And look at Canada. The Conservatives there apparently hoped for a boost, but it didn't happen. They actually suffered a bit in their last election. It served as a kind of warning, perhaps.
So a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
And Maria Taflaga says Australia is seeing a sort of diluted version of this.
Right. Taflaga's idea is interesting. She calls it a rally around the flag effect.
Okay.
Her argument is that Trump's actions, his unpredictability on the world stage, have kind of inadvertently helped incumbent leaders in places like Australia and Canada.
Hope that.
Because voters, faced with all this potential instability linked to Trump, might just think, well, better the devil you know. Stick with the current leader, the perceived safer option.
Wow. Okay. That's quite a dynamic. You wouldn't automatically think that.
It's definitely counterintuitive.
Now, speaking of leaning into Trump, Clive Palmer, the article mentions him launching a party called the Trumpet of Patriots. Seriously.
Yes, seriously.
Yeah.
Clive Palmer, the mining billionaire, always colorful.
Mm,
He's gone all in with that name.
Trumpet of Patriots.
Wow, and he's vowing to, quote, end the two-party duopoly and make Australia great. Very direct echo, obviously.
So while Dutton's maybe trying to create distance, Palmer's just diving right in.
Seems like it. He's clearly trying to appeal to that same voter base.
What about Dutton's actual policies, though? Beyond the rhetoric, are there concrete things that echo Trump's agenda?
There are a few parallels, yeah. The promise to cut, what, 41,000 federal jobs? That's pretty significant. And ending work-from-home privileges for public servants. That fits a kind of back-to-basics government efficiency theme. Plus, the talk about overhauling woke school agendas.
Right, the culture war stuff again.
Exactly. Taps into those cultural grievances, which was a big part of Trump's platform, too. And remember, one of Dutton's shadow ministers actually used the Make Australia Great Again slogan.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Didn't he say it was accidental?
He claimed it was unintentional, yes. But it definitely adds to that overall picture of, at least initially, flirting with some Trump-like themes. The job cuts, the pushback on wokeness, trying to tap that same conservative vein.
Even if Dutton himself is now trying to step back a bit.
Right.
The article suggests things really shifted around January, though. Simon Jackman links it directly to Trump's influence.
Yeah, Jackman points to January as a key moment where the narrative changed, and he puts it down to Trump's impact. It seems Australians were paying pretty close attention to specific U.S. actions.
Like, what specific things resonated over here?
Well, there were concerns from U.S. drug companies about Australia's medicine subsidy program, the PBS.
Okay.
Then Peter Navarro, Trump's trade advisor, claimed Australian aluminum was killing the U.S. market. And even Senator Mark Warner criticized tariffs on Australia, a close ally. Those kinds of comments got noticed.
But it wasn't just the talk, was it? The market reaction caused real worry.
That seems crucial. Jackman highlighted how the market sell-off after the tariff announcements hit older Australians' retirement savings, superannuation funds.
Ah, so it became personal, tangible.
Exactly. That kind of thing creates real anxiety. Suddenly, it's not just abstract politics. It's about your future, your savings. And maybe questioning the U.S. relationship? Hang on, I thought the Americans liked us.
That quote really nails it, doesn't it? That sense of confusion and concern. So that's likely why Dutton tried to distance himself in that leaders' debate.
It looks that way. When asked if he trusted Trump, his answer, "I don't know Donald Trump, I've never met him," sounds very much like an attempt to put clear blue water between himself and any negativity associated with Trump.
It's such a contrast to the last election in 2022. Back then, it felt like China was a big foreign policy issue.
Absolutely. Relations had soured, remember? Scott Morrison calling for the COVID inquiry, China hitting back with tariffs on wine, barley.
And the liberals really focused on the military threat from China then.
They did. And some analysis suggested it cost them votes among Chinese Australians.
But this time, the article says, China's hardly featuring, even with warships sailing around and live fire drills happening.
That's surprisingly subdued, yeah.
Yeah.
And Jackman's take is pretty stark. He says Trump is probably seen as a bigger threat to the global order than China right now.
Wow. So worries about U.S. reliability under Trump are actually overshadowing concerns about China.
That seems to be the dynamic at play, which naturally leads into questions about AUKUS.
Right, the big security pact with the U.S. and U.K. for nuclear submarines.
Exactly. If the U.S. seems unpredictable, if Trump questions alliances, how reliable is that deal? Critics, like Adam Bandt from the Greens, are pointing to Trump's behavior and saying, see, it's too risky to rely so heavily on the U.S.
Although both Albanese and Dutton still support AUKUS, right?
Yes, both major parties are still committed to it. But the questions about U.S. reliability are definitely part of the background noise.
Okay, another factor mentioned is the potential for a minority government even if Labor wins, and this generational shift.
Yeah, the polls suggest Labor might win, but maybe not get an outright majority.
Which means dealing with independents or minor parties.
Correct. And you've got millennials and Gen Z now outnumbering boomers and older voters for the first time. They tend to lean more progressive.
And maybe more willing to vote outside the two major parties.
Potentially. Sean Ratcliffe from Accent Research made that point about young renters being perhaps more willing to roll the dice on a minority government. Maybe they feel the major parties aren't addressing their biggest concerns like housing or climate.
So a bit more openness to shaking things up.
Could be.
Now, if Dutton does lose, Frank Bongiorno suggests we shouldn't blame it all on the Trump slump. What else does he think is going on?
Bongiorno's point is that the Liberal campaign might have been, well, a bit undercooked. Maybe too reliant on people just being unhappy with Labor.
Assuming an anti-Labor sentiment that wasn't quite there?
Perhaps. His view is the current government hasn't been seen as a disaster, so the coalition needed a stronger, more positive case for themselves, not just against Labor.
And there's even talk Dutton could lose his own seat. Dixon.
It's mentioned, yeah. He holds it by only 1.7%, which is pretty marginal.
Wow, that's tight.
Demographics are changing there, and he's got challengers like Labour's Ali France or independent Ellie Smith. It's a possibility, though Bongiorno apparently suspects Dutton will probably hang on, but it's definitely one to watch on election night.
So finally, wrapping up, what's the overall mood? Simon Jackman's take on voter sentiment.
He says there isn't that strong urge to kick the government out, not like last time. It feels less like throw the bums out, and more like, well, people just want the election over with, perhaps.
Not exactly a ringing endorsement for change.
Not really, no.
Yeah. Okay, so bringing this all together, it really seems like the shadow of Donald Trump, his policies, his global standing, it's unexpectedly playing a pretty big role in this Australian election.
Yeah, creating a real headwind for the conservative opposition, it seems.
It's quite something, isn't it? Seeing how a leader, actions on the other side of the planet can ripple out and influence domestic politics so directly here.
It really highlights how interconnected things are now.
It definitely makes you think, given how close Australia and the U.S. are, how much should Aussie political strategy really factor in potential shifts in U.S. leadership and foreign policy? What does this whole situation tell us about global politics today?
Definitely something to ponder.